Okay, so hi all, welcome to our second keynote speaker for this year conference. Please let me introduce Michał. Michał is the investor at Future Food Now. Michał is an investor in new protein startup in Asia Pacific and has been working with several plant-based companies in the region. His portfolio includes NetGen Foods, Green Rebel Foods, Better Nature, Change Foods, and Upside Foods, formerly known as Memphis Meats. He's an author of Future Food Now newsletter, which covered plant-based and cell-based startup ecosystem in APAC. So Michał, voice to you.
Thanks so much, Martin. Thanks. It's really great to be here. And I'm really looking forward to telling you a story and to listen to questions and just discuss with everyone. So, let me start with a personal story. So long time ago in pre-COVID times when, transcontinental travel was still rather easy, I had a chance with my family to visit the Buddhist nun, Jongkwan, at her monastery in South Korea. And that was already after she was actually profiled in New York Times, but still before she was made famous by Netflix Chef's Table episode that was dedicated to her. So we spent a day, with her preparing food, cooking together, and trying her amazing kimchi, some fermented outdoors for several years in these traditional barrels. And finally had this simple looking but amazing multi-course temple meal, of course, 100% vegan. So the reason I tell this story is that the food that this Buddhist nun and chef is making is a version of traditional vegan North Asian cuisine that has been served in temples of China, Japan, and Korea for centuries. Asia is, in fact, the original birthplace of meat alternatives. So it was invented by temple chefs, not unlike Nun Jongkwan. And the first imitation meat dishes are actually dating back to Tang dynasty in China in 7th or 8th century. And I think tofu is even older. Nobody knows exactly how old, but possibly over 2000 years old. So I guess the question is, how did we get from this to this? How does the modern version of meat alternatives look like in Asia? So that's actually what I will try to cover in this talk. And just one thing, I prefer to call it the new protein, not alternative protein. And the reason is that I believe that in not too distant future, it will actually become a new default choice for everyone. So let me first tell you a little bit about myself and how I got into this field, and then we can cover what's going on in Asia. So my background is in consumer technology in Europe and Asia. I've been working as early employee and executive from these companies that you see on the slide, probably recognize some of them. And I've been doing both investing and operations and always involved in fast-growing startups. Now I'm actually focused 100% on this new protein field. I invested in about 13 startups, mostly in Asia Pacific, but not exclusively. Initially, I was doing investing as angel, and now I'm also a founder and partner at new venture capital fund that is focused entirely on this field and this region. So I'm also writing about this sector in Asia, or focused on Asia, in my newsletter called Future Food Now. And I wanted to spend some time just explaining why I'm doing all of this. And the way I usually do it is using this Japanese concept of Ikigai. So the concept basically is that what we should focus in life is an intersection of what we love, what the world needs, what we are good at, and what we can be paid for. So this really speaks to me, and I define my mission as a supporting alt protein or new protein ecosystem in Asia Pacific. And my circles are, I love food and technology. I think I'm pretty good at startups and investing. It's obvious for everyone here that the world needs to move away from animal agriculture, and if it pays the bills, that's even better. I also have a selfish reason. I've been eating vegetarian and vegan for almost 10 years right now, but I used to actually love taste of meat and seafood. So I just want better products for myself. And I have really a huge respect for what you guys are doing at animal rights movement. And I think we are working together towards the same goals, just from slightly different angles. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Asia. Let me define first what's the scale of the problem we are addressing here. So Asia, as you may know, is the largest and the fastest growing animal protein market in the world. So this chart shows meat consumption, just meat without seafood. And you can see clearly, this red part of the chart is really representing Asia. So what's interesting is that consumption of meat per capita is actually much lower than in the West. But just sheer number of people, just the population size makes it bigger in terms of consumption and production than any other region. Asia is also a major producer and exporter of seafood. So this chart actually represents the capture fishery production. And if it looks somehow optimistic recently, if you look at the last years, it looks a little flat. Wait for the next one. So this is the aquaculture production. So meaning fish and seafood farms. So which essentially could be described as factory farms for fish. And are obviously horrible in terms of animal welfare. So Asia by far is the biggest and basically dominating this industry globally. So, when you take it all together, we really have an important issue to address here. So billions of animals killed, huge impact on the environment as well as human health. But I want to talk about solutions, some amazing innovators across the region that are working on better products that do not require animals to be killed. So I mentioned earlier that Asia is a place where original meat alternatives were invented many, many centuries ago. So these products actually stayed around, and in 20th century, there were quite a few producers of so-called, for lack of better term, Asian mock meat. So if you're old enough and long-time vegetarian, you probably tried some of these products. There are several problems with these products. They are actually targeted towards very niche market. When you look at Asia, it's basically religious vegetarians that are targeted by these producers of this particular products, mostly Buddhist vegetarians across different countries. And some of these producers also found a secondary market in sort of Western hippies, especially in the early years of this movement, and started to export to the West. Another problem is, they are not necessary. Some are not so bad, but these are also not great products when it comes to taste or texture and how they replace the taste and texture of meat. And even worse, they are actually not improving. Like if you look at some of these producers, they just stick to what they know. It's relatively simple technology that they're using and not trying to improve or produce better versions of their products. And last but not least, they typically have pretty horrible branding, marketing, and packaging, as you can see on this slide here. And I'm sure you know that like the market for modern alternatives like Beyond Meat or Impossible Foods is actually not driven by folks like us, vegans or vegetarians. These are actually meat eaters who are really buying this stuff, or more precisely, meat eaters sometimes, or meat reducers that are sometimes called flexitarians. So this is kind of a global scale. There are some consumer studies that are suggesting that about 40%, 42% of consumers around the world define themselves as meat reducers or flexitarians. And actually the same is true in Asia Pacific. So at least some markets, some leading markets like Singapore, Hong Kong, are actually at sort of similar level in terms of people who are already reducing meat consumption. So, I want to actually talk a little bit about, and just let me rewind here. So I want to talk a little bit about specific products and companies and founders. Just use few examples to give you a sense of what's going on in this sector in Asia Pacific right now, and it's really inspiring in my opinion. So let's start from OmniPork, which is a plant-based pork, and it's possibly the best example of this Asian plant-based meat 2.0 that I want to cover here. So the flagship product from this company is actually the ground pork made of soy and rice proteins, which is designed from ground up for Asian cuisine applications. So you may know that in Chinese cuisine, for example, most of the pork is actually not used the way we would use pork in the West, as sort of sausages or pork chops, but a lot of it is actually ground. It's sometimes even used on top of vegetables. And so vegetable is the main part of the dish, but then this ground pork is used on top of it. So this company designed this product around this Asian or Chinese cuisine applications. And they are originally from Hong Kong, already available in more than 10 markets, including China, and already partnering with restaurants from all the way from high-end restaurants to sort of Michelin star restaurants to mass market chains. And they are trying to address the huge problem. So most of the pigs that are currently alive and in the world and obviously destined for pork are in Asia, and actually most of them in China. So there are more than 500 million pigs in Asia, predominantly in China. It's a fascinating founding story. So initially, this company, the parent company for this product that is called the Green Monday Group, was a social movement. So sort of a meatless Mondays of Asia. And it evolved into restaurant chain and distribution company for Western brands. So they were one of the first to distribute Beyond Meat and a few other products in Asia, and ultimately moved towards their own product. I think what's very interesting is the way they try to address it is also through, making this plant-based meat looking very modern and very sexy, if you will. So their stores are looking very much like you could mistake them for Apple Store almost. They're really very modern and very very progressive. So that's another photo from inside of their Shanghai store recently. So they're really trying to, like break away from this perception of mock meat in Asia being this old school product for very niche product into kind of positioning it as a future of protein. So more recently, this company developed a plant-based luncheon meat, or SPAM as it's known in the West, which surprisingly is actually quite popular junk food in Asia. Most of the SPAM or luncheon meat these days is consumed in Asia. So they even partnered in McDonald's initially in Hong Kong and later in China to co-develop a breakfast menu in McDonald's featuring this Omni luncheon product. And the newest product from this company is a seafood line. So if you remember the numbers, the production and also consumption of seafood in Asia is huge. So that's a big problem to address as well, and a big market to address. And they just Omni just announced this whole line of seafood products, starting from filet and the burger format and even tuna to address this problem. And they're launching it in both Asian formats, so something that would really work in Asian cuisine, as well as Western formats, because a lot of food is obviously consumed in the Western formats, even in Asia. So that's Omni, really fascinating company. Another example is Green Rebel, which is one of my investments. Helga and Max have been running a pioneering vegan restaurant in Indonesia, or rather vegan restaurant chain. They currently have more than 10 restaurants. And just recently, about last year, they launched a plant-based meat product line and as a separate company, and it's called Green Rebel. So what's interesting here is that, again, they're trying to cater to local tastes. There are there's some availability of Western brands in Asia as well, products from Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat, but they were designed rather for Western applications. So it's not necessarily easy to adapt them to some of the Asian cuisine recipes. And these products are designed from the ground up for that, and specifically in this case for Indonesian or Southeast Asian flavors. So they have products like beef rendang, for example, in a plant-based version, or satay, including chicken satay, very, very popular in Indonesia and beyond. They were the first company to partner with Starbucks in Indonesia, and because of this ability to customize to local taste, they were actually able to beat international competition and win this Starbucks deal. What's very encouraging is that when they rolled it out in February in about 57 locations, selected ones in larger cities, one of these products that is visible here on the slide became a best-selling food product whatsoever, plant-based or otherwise, in Starbucks Indonesia, which obviously encouraged Starbucks to roll out these products across the country. So it's now available in every single Starbucks in Indonesia. And I think it's an interesting case as well, because these first 3 products were actually not 100% vegan. They had some animal products in them. They used 100% vegan meat alternative from Green Rebel, but other additions like cheese or pastry were not 100% vegan. But that's a good example where, like this sometimes is a stepping stone. So after seeing the success of this first range of products, Starbucks in Indonesia decided to develop another product that is 100% vegan, including all the additives and additions and pastries and whatever else was there. And it's actually a meatball sandwich that is also using Green Rebel meat alternative. And, as much as Green Rebel mostly focuses on specific applications for Asian cuisine, they also have a format that is, what happens in Indonesia right now is that more and more people also want to eat meat as we know it in the West. So, for example, there's a growing demand for steak and for steakhouses. There are actually chains of steakhouses already in Indonesia. So what Green Rebel did is developed this first Asian whole cut steak, plant-based whole cut steak, to meet this growing demand. And they partnered with 2 larger steakhouses in the country to roll it out. And it's apparently also a very popular item on their menu. Another startup from the region that I want to mention that has a very interesting story is Tyndall, also known as Next Gen Foods. What's interesting, it has been founded by by Timo and Andre, visible here on the slide, and they are both having a background in meat industry, actually. So Timo's family had meat processing company in Germany, and Andre used to work for largest animal chicken company in the world. But they have seen the light. They have seen really how horrible this industry can be, and both decided to launch this plant-based chicken company in Asia under the brand Tyndall. You actually may know Like Meat. That's the company from Germany that Timo founded before and sold. So he's the first case in our industry where there was a successful founder that sold plant-based meat, his first plant-based meat startup, and then started another one with even bigger ambition. That's very encouraging. That's just another milestone or example in this industry, a developing industry, because we've seen this in other industries in technology where successful founders went on and started another company with a bigger ambition. So this is very encouraging that is happening also in this industry. So they launched in Singapore. That was the first country where they decided to launch this product, and they actually based themselves out of Singapore as well. but they're growing very, very fast, already expanded to Hong Kong and soon expanding to a number of other countries in Asia and beyond. So they want to, out of Asia, they want to become a global leader of plant-based chicken. And this product is very versatile. So it's designed for both Western and Asian applications. So what you can see here, for example, is chicken katsu, and some, I believe, some dumplings or buns as well, Asian style buns with a chicken filling. But it also works for burgers and for a number of other dishes. So they design it from ground up to be very versatile. And speaking of Singapore, Singapore is actually becoming more and more of an alternative protein hub in the region and beyond. And that is actually a very interesting story as well. What is driving it? So Singapore is relying big time on food imports. So it's only less than 10% of food that is actually produced locally. More than 90% is imported. And the government set this special strategy that is called 30 by 30, where they want to produce at least 30% of food locally by 2030. And one of the pillars of this strategy is actually alternative protein support, for active support from government for this alternative protein, new protein industry. So that comes in the form of funding. It comes in the form of making like accelerating regulations when it's necessary, and just generally attracting companies, international and local, building a local startup ecosystem to develop this industry and build this food security for Singapore that they want. And the side effect for Singapore, or the secondary reason, is actually ability to build themselves as this hub of new growing industry, and basically attract more talent, attract more investment, and become a global leader in this field. What's making it a little bit easier, of course, is that there is no pushback from any local industry. So there's hardly any meat industry in Singapore. So it's a little bit easier than in some other countries with a strong meat lobby. So as an example, how this works specifically in Singapore, Singapore became the first country in the world to approve cell-based meat product for sale. So I would assume that most of you know what cell-based meat is, sometimes called cultivated meat. It's basically the meat built from actual animal cells that were taken by a biopsy from a live animal and multiplied in bioreactor to build actual animal tissue, but without killing an animal. So this is the technology that is very new. That this is literally the very first product in the world that has been approved for sale anywhere, and that consumers could try. I had a chance actually to try it myself as a prototype about 2 years ago. The format is relatively simple. It's a plant-based chicken nugget, so it's not a very complex structure. So it did taste like a chicken nugget to me, and most people say the same. But in this simple format, it's very, very similar to actual chicken nugget. The way it is made, as I mentioned, it's actually in bioreactors. The company that got this approval is a company called Eat Just, and they use a special brand for this product called Good Meat. And they produce it in bioreactors. The process is not perfect, to be clear. It's still relatively small scale, and also unfortunately it does use still animal inputs. So it's using something called FBS as a growth factor to make this cells multiply faster, and FBS is an animal-derived product. But the company is already working on a completely animal-free process to develop it. So again, like the way I look at it pragmatically is a stepping stone to something that ultimately removes any harm for animals. This product can actually be now ordered with delivery. So there's a local delivery company called Food Panda that partnered with Eat Just to make limited quantities available for delivery. So anybody in Singapore can actually deliver it, I believe, once a week right now. So it's really limited quantities, and they had to limit the time as well. But it is scaling up. So we just hired a person to scale up the business in Singapore, and they have big plans for the region. Another local company is Shock Meats, that is co-founded by 2 female scientists, and they are working on a cell-based shrimp and lobster, and already showing some prototypes and setting up pilot plans with plans to launch next year, as early as next year. And again, seafood and the production in Asia is horrible for animals, but also for environment. A lot of these farms are really like farms or factory farms or aquaculture, especially aquaculture production. They have very, very low standards, and it's all about driving the price as low as possible. So these are really promising solutions to solve some of these problems in the long term. Again, very early stage. They haven't got their product approved yet. They did some tastings. I also had a chance to try some of their early prototypes, and it looks very promising, but it will take time to achieve the proper scale. So these startups are really raising a lot of money to develop their technology and to educate the market through their marketing and scale up production. So you can see some of the examples here. These are best funded startups in this field in the region right now. And some of them we talked about. And what's interesting is that really the largest investors in this field in Asia and beyond globally are investing in these companies. So there's a lot of interest from not just specialized investors, but also general venture capital investors and other capital allocators. Speaking of which, actually, Singapore has its own government fund called Temasek, which is a massive fund that is investing across different industries. And it happens to be the largest investor in this field anywhere globally. So they invested more than $500 million in alternative protein or new protein startups across the world, including in Asia. I would say there are 2 main challenges in Asia currently. One is perception. So actually, meat is a symbol of affluence in a sense across Asia, especially developing markets in Asia. So plant protein like tofu or tempeh traditionally has been seen as cheap, something for people who cannot afford meat. So there's this, as people move towards more and more people move towards middle class. They couldn't afford meat before or any other animal products. Now they can, and they actually want it. And that creates interesting, unique challenge for these new protein companies to position their products. In a sense, they need to be, they need to be better. They need to be as considered as much of a symbol of affluence as animal meat. I don't think that exact challenge has its equivalent in the West, so it's quite unique to Asia. And some companies are really doing a good job, I believe, on this. And this gives obviously a hope of ultimately leapfrogging, for some of these people who didn't eat much meat before. There's a possibility that they actually at some point leapfrog just directly to this plant-based and cell-based alternatives rather than eating a lot of animal derived products. It's an interesting challenge, and we'll see how this develops. Another one is just pricing. It's not unlike anywhere else in the world, but it's still out of reach for many folks. But as production scales up, it will inevitably become cheaper. And as other industries show, in Asia, it's possible to produce affordable products at scale. So, I'm a big believer that these products over time will become accessible and affordable to everybody. So, I'm almost at the end. It's looking at the progress that these great founders from across Asia Pacific are making makes me really very optimistic personally. It's just amazing, and it's literally last few years that everything got very, very accelerated. I've been investing and writing about this topic for last 3 to 4 years. Initially, when I started, there was very little happening, and it was also very hard to get. I was literally the only person interested in this topic, and only media interested in this topic in Asia Pacific. Was the first to cover a lot of the startups, but recently all the mainstream media and general public are, there's a lot of conversation about these topics, about these startups, about these products. So that's great to see. So, just to finish up, I believe your efforts are very important in educating consumers, working on regulations. So thank you for all that you are doing in your line of work. I will continue my mission to support startups and the industry, so we can really provide these great alternatives for people who are ready to switch, even if initially only part-time. So it will take patience and it will take time, but I believe together we can really get to the point where no animals are killed for food. Thanks so much. That's it for me. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer.
So thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting, and I think this topic is you can talk about a long time. So we have now the Q&A session. So here are 2 questions that people ask. So most upvoted of them is, what's your estimate for when more complex cultured meat structures will be available for the general public? The person that asked the question said that I'm thinking steak rather than ground beef, chicken breast rather than nuggets, etc.
Yep, that's a good question. So, in Asia context, this company that launched this chicken nuggets, which is Eat Just, they are already working on several other a little bit more complex products, and they announced this. And the way the approval process works in Singapore, it's actually not just even company per company, but like product by product. So they need to go through another approval process to get it approved and get it to the consumers. So this will happen relatively soon. They were talking about another product to be launched possibly this year. Whether this will be a chicken breast or other chicken, definitely chicken, but just more complex format. Another company outside of Asia that is gearing up to launch something a little bit more complex, which will be a chicken breast, is Upside Foods, previously known as Memphis Meats. I also invested in them a while ago. And they just announced teaming up with a chef in San Francisco, who and I think they showed some images of actual chicken breasts being cooked by the chef. It's still not approved to be sold to consumers in the US. So this will take a while, I guess, another few months at least, but they are ready to go. And then, there are more companies working on more complex products. I think the question here is more, some of this, there is a possibility, like there's a technology to produce them and to make them and to on a small, tiny scale to even sell them when they are obviously approved, this more complex products, I mean, very soon. The question is still about the scale, like, can you actually make them at the price that will be acceptable by consumers anytime soon? And I think this will take another few years to get there. But in the meantime, I think what we will see is like small scale rollouts, like single restaurant, maybe just even single day, just a proof of concept of the more complex products. And what will be more commercialized or mass market will be the simpler products like chicken nuggets. And maybe just the last thing on this question, hybrids. I'm a big believer in hybrids. I think we'll see increasingly some of the cell-based technology, for example, cell-based fat, animal identical fat, that will be applied to plant-based products. So that's another possibility here for coming years.
Okay, thank you. So here are the next questions. What do you think become more prevalent in the future, cell-based meat or alternative protein? And when do you estimate these two together could surpass sales of animal-based meat from farms?
Yep, another good question. So as I was just mentioning, I think increasingly when I look at the market, it's not either or. It's somewhere in between. It's basically a spectrum of plant-based products, hybrid products, and cell-based products for different applications. So plant-based are here and now. So obviously they are dominating the market right now. I think increasingly we'll see hybrids, which means plant-based products with some cell-based ingredients. There's also like the whole another area of precision fermentation and fermentation-based technologies, which I think also will play a role here, especially for dairy and some other products. So I think it's not either or. It's really this combination of rubber spectrum. So that's kind of the first part. The question, of course, about when this will overtake animal-based meat, it's a big one. It's nobody knows for sure, and I can share some of my thoughts. I'm quite realistic in our modeling for our investments. We are assuming we're just relying on some of the research that is out there, that is assuming more of a 10 to 15% market share of these alternatives within the next 10 years or so. So I think in a decade, it will still be relatively small in a big scale of things, but big enough to justify continued development of these products. Because if you just think about the total protein market in the world is about $2 trillion, animal protein and animal products, $2 trillion today, probably growing to something like 3 trillion in 10, 15 years. So even if it's only 10%, it's a $300 billion market. And the reason I mentioned money here is that this really speaks to, investors and even to some founders. So basically this helps to elevate, to pump even more capital into this market, attract even more founders, even more talent. So basically grow this industry further. So I think we need to be realistic. I would still assume it's 10, 15% of total market in 10 years. But because this is already multi-$100 billion market, there will be continued work from there. And then, whether it will take another 5, 10 years or 15 to get to actually overtake animal protein, it's anybody's guess, but I think it will happen.
Okay. Thanks. And what do you think, what percentage of the plant-based startups in Asia have you seen fail? What do you think separates the success from the failures?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's two things that we are, like when I'm investing, what I'm looking at is two sort of major components would be a team. And because I invest very often very early, it's not really a product. It's just the potential of a team to develop a product or to improve the early prototype of the product. Because often when I invest, there's nothing yet. Maybe there's a prototype if it's a plant-based product or early version of it. And if it's a cell-based product, there's not even a prototype. So I'm really looking at the background of the team, how committed they are as well. They're, are they impact driven? And this doesn't mean that they have to be vegan or vegetarian necessarily, but like they need to care about, something more than just money here. So they may be driven by sustainability or environment, but there must be this additional driver. So that's sort of a team component, but the market component is important as well. And market and timing, are the market they're trying to address big enough in a short enough span to kind of make this investment from a purely commercial terms make sense? Because unfortunately, or fortunately or not unfortunately, but that's the reality, we are sort of constrained by certain economics of investing, right? So especially in the venture capital world, there are timelines that we need to look at and outcomes or exit multiples that we need to look at as well. So there must be this kind of opportunity to achieve this basically very high exit multiples, which usually coincide with a large impact as well. So I'm rambling a little bit, but what I'm trying to say is if it's a tiny market, a very early stage market, it might be less interesting for me as an investor, right, than large market that already is at this stage that from this point it can develop very quickly.
Okay.
And some of the markets in Asia are just very early stage, so compared to others. So yeah, that's the point.
All right. So the next question is looking less related maybe to the topic itself, but more to your job, you can say so. So what can less affluent people do if they want to follow your footsteps? Here, Philip writes, I would like to throw money at new protein startups, but I don't have millions of dollars to spare.
That's a great question. Now, I should probably have mentioned this in my presentation. So I'm so glad that somebody asked this. I think there are ways if you sort of want to channel some capital towards this sector, there are ways to do it, even if it's our relatively small amounts. The best would be, there are two major ways currently. One is obviously public investing. So there are two companies that are large companies that IPO'd already, and that's obviously Beyond Meat and Oatly. So it's relatively easy to buy shares of those companies. Wouldn't necessarily have a huge impact. They already raised money from, if you buy shares, it doesn't necessarily mean that they get more money. That's not how it works. But it might be, if you believe in this, it might be just a good way. If you believe in the growth of the sector, might be a good way to invest your own money and from sort of return perspective. And obviously, it creates generally more movement in this sector. Another way is crowdfunding. There's a lot of increasingly very, very interesting startups, very good startups that are crowdfunding. Traditionally, crowdfunding was limited to smaller local companies, and by no means this is bad. This is great actually to support those as well. But what happened over the last few years is that there's something called equity crowdfunding, where there are very interesting and attractive from investment standpoint and impact standpoint, larger startups that are using crowdfunding on top of the regular venture capital round. So the recent one in Europe was, for example, Hera. That's a Spanish startup doing mostly chicken products. And they raised millions actually through crowdfunding, but the check size was relatively small. And this is actually very impactful and also potentially good return on investment. So these are kind of main two ways to do it. If it's a little larger amount, so a few thousand to maybe $10,000, $15,000 or euros, it's sometimes possible also to do early stage angel investment, maybe not by one person, but just team up with several people, for example, and channel the money into sort of angel round of some of the startups. It's not always easy to access them, but if you are well connected in the industry, sometimes it's or have some friends that are starting the startup, it's the next step. But crowdfunding, that I would recommend definitely to look through several platforms. I don't have them top of my head, but I think it's easy to find the European, especially start platforms in the UK, and I think there's one more that Hera used. I can look it up later if somebody's interested.
Okay. So the next question is, what's the biggest bottleneck for scaling up the production of cultivated meat?
Yeah, so there are several. One would be the just still very expensive growth media. So just the feed that or the substances that need to be fed to the cells to multiply. And a lot of startups are working on solutions. There are some breakthroughs, but it's still relatively expensive. So this is one bottleneck. Another one is at a higher scale, like we just don't have enough, like big enough bioreactors and enough of these bioreactors. And to be fair, actually, the overall equipment or hardware that is necessary for that. So many of you probably know that this technology originally was used by pharmaceutical industry at much smaller scale and at much higher costs. So to scale it up from this very small, high cost pharma production to low cost and high and big scale food production is a big challenge. So there will be solutions needed across the whole process, essentially, from growth media to bioreactors to other equipment, even to energy, actually. So that's obviously it's possible to fuel these factories by traditional energy, but then the whole environmental promise is gone, right? Because that actually is very energy intense process. So to really achieve the environmental benefits here, we need to fuel this by or fuel the energy source needs to be clean, basically, whether it's solar or any other renewable energy. So quite a few challenges, but fortunately, the optimist in me would say that there are super smart people working on all of the solutions, either within these larger startups that are working on meat products, or there are increasingly also specialized startups that are doing components of this whole process.
Okay, thank you. So the last question, I think, and it's a good one to sum up this lecture. Do you think we will live to see a decrease in global meat consumption, or will this take far longer?
Yes, I think there was a similar question before, right? In terms of the timelines. Yeah, I mean, like I'm optimistic. I think we'll definitely see the decline in animal meat consumption and replacement by these technologies. But I'm also realistic, so this will not happen overnight or even next year or two. I think it will, for proper, like replacement with like more than 50%, it will take several decades. But I think we should sort of, celebrate every step on the way. And what the industry has been able to achieve the last few years is already amazing, I believe, and it's building a super strong foundation. Basically, at this point, I'm a strong believer that this is unstoppable. This will happen. This is just a matter of time. So all the work that I do and that others are doing in this field is about accelerating this process, because obviously the faster it goes, more animals we save, and we save the planet as well.
Okay. I hope so will do. So thank you very much for your lecture, and I invite you all to join our networking session with Michał. You can see the link will be pasted in the chat room. So please join us, and we will stay here, I think, for 20 minutes to wait for your questions. So thank you once again, Michał, and we see us maybe somewhere in the future.
Yep. Thanks so much, Martin. Thanks, everyone.